so much for your time today. I love The Wild Robot. I think we have to start with the question that's on so many people's minds after they see The Wild Robot, which is who the hell gave you permission to go this hard on the Wild Robot score? I mean, I hope you're feeling the love in the couple weeks since it's come out, because your music is just making such a huge impact. Uh,
Appreciate that.
yeah, so where did you get started on the Wild Robot? What drew you to the film?
Yeah, so I got a call from Mike Knobloch and Natalie Hayden from Universal about the possibility about working on it, and they asked me to read the book before I had a meeting with Kris. And I sat down with Kris Sanders and Jeff Herman, the producer, and we just had a conversation about what Kris envisioned for the film and how he thought music might play a role in it. And I remember that first meeting. For me, I was just immediately blown away by what they were going to do visually because they already had concept art that showed this painterly style that they were going for and how much they were looking at, the history of animation as inspiration, going all the way back to Bambi and these like hand painted images from that era of animation and wanting to find a way to bring that in today's time. And we talked about how much music was going to be a character in the film and that Kris would what he said was he would build these houses for music where he wanted music to really lead the emotional feeling in those moments, and how much he knew that he would have moments of stripping away dialogue or sections where there wouldn't be any dialogue and music would really be carrying the emotions. And so I think those two things for me really set the bar for what we wanted music to do in the film.
Mm. Yeah, I'd heard that quote from Kris talking about the houses of music, like you said, and wanting. I think I saw him say wanting music to be our voice in
Mm.
these in certain sequences. So with big spaces like that for the music to shine through, were you scoring to picture a lot, or were you just composing based on the themes of what was happening at that moment?
Yeah, for me, I think going back to their inspiration with early animation and also knowing how like visually captivating it was going to be, I needed to score to picture as much as possible. So I started really early and I was writing just to animatics. And it was basically following the pace of each of those sequences and trying to make sure that we were feeling the emotional journey of each of those moments. And those animatics were pretty specific in terms of when there might be, little cuts or hits and things to hit musically. But as animation started to come in, then I would continue to fine tune the music because for me, when you have something that looks that visually beautiful and there's not much dialogue, to me, the music needed to continually be evolving and active, even in really subtle ways, so that there's always something that's kind of keeping us locked in and we never really want to just kind of like sit back. And I felt like if I wrote away from picture too much, then it would kind of create these things that weren't responding to what we're seeing visually. And my own inspiration from that era of film music where the composers are writing very, very intentionally to what we're seeing on screen is what was a big inspiration for me and how I approach this. There was one instance actually where I wrote the main theme for this migration sequence. That was kind of the only instance where Kris actually encouraged me to write away from picture because he wanted the picture to follow the music. And so that was really exciting to once we had a theme that we both felt strong about. I wrote that piece of music away from picture, just following the journey of the music. And then they actually worked, Mary Blee, the editor, and Kris with the animators worked to actually write or craft the imagery to the music in that instance.
Hmm. Well, I'm definitely going to want to come back to the migration sequence, which is just
Yep.
unforgettable, for sure. So we'll come back to that. But I'd love to hear about the textures and the sounds that you came up with for the Wild Robot. So much of the Wild Robot deals with the way that the mechanical world and the natural world sort of intersect or find ways to commingle. How did you mirror some of those textures in the sounds that you created?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I did was create um, a palette that was inspired by that combination you just spoke about. First, it was finding and creating synth sounds that would represent Roz and this futuristic kind of sound. But because it's Roz on this island, I knew that the organic aspect needed to be really at the forefront. Like the synths are always doubling a lot of the orchestration, and they're a very huge presence, especially as we find more and more of that technology throughout the story when we visit the actual Dome City, and when the Ventra and those other robots come to the island, and moments where Roz is really leading the story. Those synths come out and are a bit more flourished, but it was important for me to think about how to represent the wild in a way that was a little bit more unique, just because my first thought is how much we typically represent the wild with like ethnic flutes and like different things like that, like ethnic wind instruments. And I didn't want something that would place us anywhere culturally too specifically. And so in my research, I found this percussion ensemble called Sandbox Percussion. A friend of mine named Thomas recommended them to me, and uh, they are this incredible classical percussion ensemble that build these like found instruments where they'll have, tuned metal pipes, or they'll have a set of teacups or amglockens that are pitched to different pitches. And uh, with them in mind, I started writing music that felt more like sound design turned into percussion. And I thought it might be fun to have this kind of like ASMR quality to that material, so that there was like this percussion ensemble on top of the orchestra, on top of the synths and the other percussion that was a little bit more traditional. And so my first couple of pieces I wrote for Kris was trying to approximate the sound of Sandbox and their approach to playing. And then I collaborated with them to figure out how to build my own library of sounds to then write with for the rest of the film that utilize them as an important texture for that kind of wilderness quality.
Hmm. Did that come finding the textures like that? Did that come before or after the themes? Did you start with sitting at the piano, discovering the themes, or did you start with what do we want it to generally sound like?
It it was a little bit more the sound first, and then the themes shortly after. So the very first cue I wrote was this raccoon sequence when the raccoons are, stealing everything from Roz's body. And that was purely trying to get after that sound, that percussion sound, and some of the synth sounds and things like that. But the very next cue I wrote was the main theme, the migration piece. And after I had that main theme, I mean, we worked on that for several weeks just on that one theme. And once we had that, then I kind of branched out and created Roz's theme and Fink's theme and Brightbill's theme. And then as I was creating those themes, the palette continued to develop, especially with Roz's theme. That was when I really dived into the synth sounds and what things would represent her and that palette. So then once I had all of that, then I started writing to picture based on those themes and that palette being kind of explored.
Hmm. Well, yeah, the migration theme, listening to it, it feels like we're watching one of those classic score moments right before our eyes. It's clearly just a future classic already. The moment is so deep, not just because the music is incredible, but also because of the themes of parenthood that moment is touching on. And I understand you became a father towards the beginning of production, or shortly before production. How
Yeah.
much was your daughter on your mind as you scored that, and how did thoughts of your daughter impact the music of that moment?
Yeah, I mean, it was everything. I mean, what's interesting is that the first time I approached that theme, I had seen the film a handful of times at that point, and I knew that the migration scene was a moment that score would not only be heavily featured, but it's kind of like, you know, maybe the biggest pinnacle of the emotional journey that they have. And because of that, I knew it needed to be the main theme for this story, and that would help me have material to then build out through the rest of the score. And so I told Kris I wanted to tackle that first, or shortly after I did the raccoon sequence. And my first pass at it, I was thinking about my daughter. She was like 7 months old when I started writing this piece, and the thought I had was, saying goodbye to her when she's going to college, because that's kind of what's happening in terms of Ross saying goodbye to Bright Bill. And I remember I wrote this piece of music that I felt really proud of and really excited to share with Kris. I sat down and played it for him, and he was like, this isn't the right feeling." And what's ironic is that he was like, you should just imagine that you're going to drop Coda off at college and see how that feels. And I told him that's what I actually imagined, and not really sure why I'm missing the mark. And the more we talked about it, the more he pointed out, and I realized just, the complexity of that moment. And what was really interesting for me was I got home and thought about it more, and thought about like looking at my daughter, and recognized that I actually didn't want to imagine it in the way that Roz and Brightbill are saying goodbye in that moment. Because my first pass was something that was very sweet and nostalgic, and didn't have the complexity of emotions that really are present in that scene. And so I just remember looking at her and thinking about, honestly, like all the ways I'm going to fail her as a parent, and like thinking about how inevitably, no matter how hard I try, there are going to be things that I do that she's going to have a tough time getting over, that she's going to have to learn how to accept about me, or forgive me for, that I'm going to have to forgive myself for, like all those things that I recognize with my own relationship with my parents, that I don't want to think about when it comes to, what my lifetime with my daughter is going to be. And so I think that thinking about what's happening with Roz and Brightbill, that they're not saying the words goodbye, they're not saying the words I love you, they're not possibly not going to see each other ever again, and thinking about being in a situation with my daughter where I've done something possibly irreparable that she may never forgive me for. And that deep emotion was something that uh I just took into playing on the piano. And usually I just improvise when I have something that's that cathartic. I just improvise until I find something that makes me feel a similar level of emotion. And so that's what led me to that theme. I just kind of improvised until I found that theme, and it just, something visceral and involuntary kind of resonated within me that felt similar to those thoughts and thinking about that feeling. So then I brought that to Kris, and Kris felt similarly, that it really captured that feeling really well. And that's when he told me, now that you have this, just right away from picture and just develop this theme more and build it out, and then we'll figure out how to shape the rest of that migration sequence to the music. And that was so freeing and amazing for him to trust me with that. But it was so helpful to have his direction to make sure that we, just handled that not with kid gloves. Like, I think that's the thing I love about this movie is that it's dealing with something so devastating as what they're dealing with in a grounded way. And so that demanded the score to also be grounded and weighty in that way too.
Hmm. I was actually starting to tear up as you were talking about that relationship. Yeah, I saw this with my twin 6-year-old boys, and
Oh,
you're
wow.
exactly right. You're exactly right. The not dealing with kid gloves and just treating it like it is, I think, is so impactful for families, for kids, for parents. It's beautiful, and your music captures that moment so
Uh,
well.
Thank you.
Sorry, let me gather myself. So, Kris, obviously you were talking about how he helped shape that sequence and telling you when it wasn't right. What was it like working with him and receiving direction when it wasn't right and receiving encouragement when it was? What was it like working with Kris?
I mean, it was amazing. Something that I've heard a few of the collaborators on this film talk about is how Kris is everyone's biggest fan, and in a way that, isn't free from him giving very clear direction as to what he's looking for, and helping guide us along the way. But, anytime I showed him something, even when it wasn't right, he was always trying to find something in it that might be helpful that we can key into. So that first version that I wrote with the migration sequence, it wasn't right emotionally, but he did pick out, how the orchestration developed and how he really liked that about it, and he was really open in that way. And he was incredibly trusting, so much so that, as like I was saying, I continued to tinker with things as I saw a picture come in and the animation develop, and I wanted to have the music really be intentional with everything we're seeing on screen. As I saw, oh, the lighting looks a little different, I think that, like, I need to add a little bit of an element here. He was always encouraging me to continue to try those things. And we worked here in my studio, like we had weekly meetings here for, the last, I'd say, almost year that I was on the project. And toward the end, it was a couple of times a week, and we just would come here, and he was always so excited. And it was great to work in the room together, because there were so many times where he would, when something wasn't necessarily perfect, we were able to, like, look at every layer of it and watch it to picture and say, like, okay, well, what's happening here? And I'd show him, okay, well, the horns are doing this and the strings are doing this thing and the percussion is doing this. And he's like, okay, well, what if we take those horns out? What does that sound like? And, what if we add another melody here? And being able to make those changes, it felt like it felt like my own childhood dream when I look at like the relationship between John Williams and Steven Spielberg, or like these kinds of director composer relationships where the composer is writing something that's so there's so much craftsmanship that's happening that the director is able to really get in there and work with them in that collaborative way, and to have that chance to do that kind of thing with Kris was really fun because it just kind of took me to my childhood dreams of what it would be like to work with the director.
Hmm. And it's also your first time scoring an animated feature. Did you find that animation gives more space for musical creativity? I find so many of the greatest scores of the last 20 years have been for animated features. Did you find a new level of creativity because of animation?
Yeah, definitely, because there's so much space that you're able to take musically, because all the sound design is all created, right? And so you're not trying to be mindful of what's happening there, because there's a collaborative process happening with the music and the sound design, where they're able to decide that, like, what, this whole section where Roz is chasing Fink, and there's all this kind of like percussion that I've added that adds to that skittering kind of feeling. That Kris is taking care of that, so we don't need to like worry so much about making it this, hyper realistic sound design. And again, because with films like this where there isn't much dialogue, it's really requiring the music to tell a story and to really evolve over the course of the sequences. And so, I think that with all of that, it is definitely really freeing. And I would say for me with this project, starting so early was really helpful with that as well. And that, I'm uh continuing to tinker with things and iterate with things. And it's not the same with live action, where they are maybe swapping entire sequences, or like they're continuing to cut things in the scene. Like with animation, after they get to a certain point, they really can't change much, because now they're sending it down the line and it needs to kind of stay where it is. And that gives me so much more time to be able to work on a scene and continue to shape it without worrying about that scene completely being reshaped, really far down the line.
That's good. And it's not just your score that made an impact on the movie. You co-wrote the song "Kiss the Sky" with Maren Morris. What was it like collaborating with her and the rest of the team to find the right tone for that track?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to say I didn't necessarily write anything. I just did the orchestral arrangement, but then really what was amazing was they trusted me to figure out how to place it in the film. Because basically Mary Blee, the editor, she had this idea for the flight training montage, where she wanted it to feel like this one long, like 6 minute arc. And the song that Maren and the songwriters wrote was only, a few minutes. And so I totally understood what Mary was going for, because she clearly had this emotional arc and journey in the way that she cut that sequence. Even though the conversation with Longneck is this kind of interstitial moment, it really emotionally feels clear to me. And so when she brought that up to me, I asked, the songwriters if they'd be willing to share the stems with me, so that I could not only orchestrate around it, but also decide how to break it up. And that was amazing for them to trust me with that, and for Maren to trust me with that, because basically I took, decided where her vocals would come in and out, and decide where the instrumentation would come in and out. And in the middle, I decided to have like a key change moment, and then reharmed it toward the end, and did all these things that I felt would have that section and sequence feel um, emotionally the way that I thought Mary was trying to shape it editorially. And then once I did that first pass, then Maren and the songwriters took it back, and they re-recorded her vocals, and they re-recorded some of the instrumentation and changed some of the instrumentation. And they gave that back to me, and then I did the same kind of tinkering with it. So it was this really fun back and forth, where they were really, really open to how I wanted to shape the song for the purposes of the movie. And then they were virtually present when we did the recording session to give some input on, like, why don't we try adding choir in this section? And, how does it sound to make things sound sparser or bigger in certain sections? And so it was a really trusting collaborative process.
That's great. Well, Kris, obviously the score that you made is so incredible. The song is great as well, and really makes an impact in the film. And now I couldn't let you go without congratulating you on your Oscar win. If I'm not mistaken, is that your Oscar there above your head? I think it
Yeah,
is.
it is. Yeah, right
There it is.
there.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, you're officially an Oscar-winning director. Do you see yourself directing more, directing a feature doc or fictional feature?
Yeah, 100%. Ben and I are actually working on a scripted feature now, and there's a couple other short docs that he and I are talking about. And for me, I think the reason why I became a musician is because of it being a vehicle for storytelling. Like I fell in love with piano because it became this way for me to express things that I couldn't express verbally, and having the idea of storytelling through music is what latched me into music and latched me into the film scoring. And so directing has become this extension of that, and another fun way to learn how to tell story, and also like learn how to collaborate, because I think that's the thing that's so amazing about it, is being able to collaborate with a cinematographer or an editor and understand how much each of these crafts, like the thing I love about talking to a cinematographer is that it reminds me of my own process as a composer, where that cinematographer, if I tell them I want this to feel really intimate and warm, they know exactly what lens to use, how to, affix the lighting so that we get that feeling. And to me, that's like what it is to be a composer. It's like, Kris asked me to make something feel a certain way. It's my job to understand how to tinker with the orchestration and the mix and the production to make it feel that way. And yeah, so directing just feels like an extension of that craftsmanship in a way that I really love to learn about.
Amazing. Well, Kris, I appreciate your time. Can't wait to see what's next from you, both musically and directing. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daniel. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Kris.